Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Higher Education Community Forum. This is a virtual collaborative space that emerged as a result of the COVID-19 outbreak. And today, we're so happy to have you all here with us, and we'll be hosting a session on international higher education. So just to give you a little bit of background about the Higher Ed Community Forum, it has been created in collaboration with scholars, researchers, and practitioners connecting virtually on Twitter. It originated from, it's a brainchild of Eric Felix, who put together a list of higher ed speakers to offer support in the transition to online instructions and provide guest scholar discussions for folks who would be teaching this semester. If you're interested in participating in future seminars, feel free to go to this truncated link that's posted there, and there's also more information online on Twitter. So this will be a 4-part webinar series. So this is the second one, and there'll be 2 more, one on conducting critical policy analysis and advocacy on Thursday the 16th, and another one, the 4th and final one, supporting queer student success on Monday, April 20th. So before joining, we would appreciate if you could take this quick audience poll so that we can get a better idea of our audience. So participants, you should have access to this poll, and just let us know if you're a student, instructor, researcher, practitioner, policymaker, or just or community member. We'd be curious to know. We'll give you a few seconds to do this. Alrighty, it looks like we have predominantly practitioners at 29% and students joining us in the audience today. We also have a few instructors, researchers, and community members. So welcome all, and thank you for joining us and giving us part of your morning. So the agenda for today is to do a quick overview of scholar profiles. So we have 3 scholars on the panel today, so I'll give just a few introductions for each of them. And then each of our scholars has prepared a brief presentation, so we'll hear remarks from Doctors Morrison, Yao, and Whatley, and then we'll have a panel discussion as well as a Q&A that's open to the audience. Okay, dokes. So our first panelist for today is Dr. Jeana Morrison, who is an Associate Program Officer at the Spencer Foundation, where she serves as the program lead for the Large Research Grants on Education program. Jeana received her Ph.D. or Dr. Morrison received her Ph.D. from Drexel University School of Education, and she previously worked as a program director and counseling coordinator for the Upward Bound program, where she let her passion for working with youth of color ground and direct her work. To that end, her research examines the ways in which higher education, policy, and race collide to create unique experiences for Black students across the African diaspora. She's interested in understanding how access and equity policies are implemented transnationally, paying particular attention to how post-secondary student understandings and critiques can contribute to policymaking processes. We also have Dr. Melissa Whatley, who is a postdoctoral research scholar in the Belk Center for Community College Leadership and Research at North Carolina State University, where she conducts research on issues related to community college student success and teaches quantitative research methods. In her work, she applies advanced quantitative approaches to explore issues related to underrepresented students in U.S. international education, particularly low-income and community college students. Her work has appeared in journals such as Research in Higher Education, the Community College Review, and the Journal of Studies in International Education. And we also have Christina Yao, Dr. Christina Yao, who is an assistant professor and program coordinator at the University of South Carolina. She is a qualitative researcher who primarily studies undergraduate and graduate student engagement and learning in higher education. She operationalizes her research focus through 3 connected topical areas, including international and comparative education, teaching and learning, and graduate education. Some current projects include research on the college transition process for international graduate students of color, graduate students' international scholar practitioner development, and transnational pressures on teaching and learning in Vietnam. Dr. Yao is involved in the leadership of several professional organizations, including the Association for the Study of Higher Education and the Comparative and International Education Society. She also serves on the editorial board for several journals, including the Journal of Diversity in Higher Education, the Journal for College Student Development, and the Journal of International Students. And I am Dr. Masada Tailu, and I'm an assistant professor in the Mary Lou Fulton Teachers College at Arizona State University, where I teach higher and post-secondary education. In addition to this, we have a few scholar profiles, so a few readings uploaded by the authors or the presenters for today. They're available at this truncated site. If you have not had a chance to read these articles, we encourage you to do so after the conclusion of today's webinar. And now I'll turn it over first to Dr. Morrison, who will be providing individual remarks. And then after that, feel free for presenters to go in order listed on the screen. And then I'll unmute myself after you all have concluded to facilitate the panel discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Hailu. And thank you to Dr. Eric Felix and Julie Marlott for the invitation to be on this panel. And of course for their coordinating efforts. So again, my name is Jeana Morrison, and I am very excited to share this presentation with you that's based on a paper that I'm currently working on entitled Towards a Global Understanding of Affirmative Action, Lessons from Brazil. And so as you all know, the timing is limited, so I encourage you to please engage in the Q&A if you'd like more detail on some of the ideas that are briefly touched on in my talk. So I'll begin with some background information to ground the study that this paper is based on. I will then communicate the research question that guides the study, followed by the conceptual framework. I will, of course, describe the methodology, and we'll conclude with findings from the study and how I feel that those findings are significant. Next slide, please. So as you all may know, issues of access and equity are prominent in higher education systems, not just in the US, but around the world. And so how access and equity manifests is varied and wide-ranging, resulting in a number of ways that these issues can be addressed. So in the last 70 years, over 40 countries spanning across 6 different continents have developed some form of affirmative action to make higher education more accessible and equitable. And so here, affirmative action is defined as the deliberate expansion of access to higher education for underrepresented or oppressed groups, commonly characterized by race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, gender, and other social categories. So for me, I've been interested in race-based affirmative action. One, because of its proliferation in the current US political and educational arena. And then 2, because of the lack of knowledge on the topic that is being used outside of the US. So the debate on using race-based affirmative action in higher ed admissions is a worldwide occurrence, taking place in countries such as India, Malaysia, and South Africa. Yet the affirmative action scholarship reflects a US-centric discourse that excludes research and policy analysis outside of the American context. So to address this gap, I argue that knowledge production from the Global South that focuses on affirmative action in particular should be included within mainstream policy discourses. Next slide, please. So, in order to address this gap, I ask, what can the global community learn from Brazil's 21st century experience with affirmative action? Next slide, thank you. So this study is grounded in the understanding that global knowledge production and mobilization are structured in terms of centrality and marginality. And so highly resourced countries of the global north occupy the core or the metropole, and less resourced countries of the South are located at the periphery. And so this structure reflects what Collier et al. Have identified as the global economy of knowledge. And so from this perspective, we're able to clearly recognize hierarchies established during the era of colonization and imperialism that reinforce Northern paradigms and stifle thought systems originating from the South. So more specifically, using the lens of the global economy of knowledge helps us to view the study of affirmative action as limited, where it has come to be understood as a policy predominantly used and researched in the metropole or in countries like Canada, United States, and Europe. Next slide. Next slide, please. Thank you. So now I just would like to sort of put some of that epistemological grounding into context by discussing the Brazilian case and why it is significant to a global understanding of affirmative action. So in 2001, the Brazilian government legislated the use of quotas to implement affirmative action policy, which allowed for the reservation of spaces for students attending universities based on several criteria such as race, public school attendance, and socioeconomic status. So affirmative action was then declared constitutional in 2012 by the Brazilian Supreme Court. Between 2004 and 2010, 34 out of 49 federal universities adopted some form of affirmative action policy in their higher education admissions. So this swift movement of expanding higher ed access has made Brazil one of the most aggressive representations of affirmative action in the 21st century. So it's important to note, though, that while this policy was being mandated at the federal level, implementation at the state and institution levels varied across the country. Additionally, while racial inequity was the original platform cited for why quotas were necessary, recent amendments to the policy include greater emphasis on students' social class, resulting in a distinction in policy implementation that is either race conscious or race neutral. Next slide, please. So to get an understanding of the Brazilian case in particular and what we can learn from it in terms of how it has implemented affirmative action, I conducted a critical policy ethnography. And so this particular methodological orientation illuminates structures of power and inequality to extend focus beyond the micro level of understanding culture and beliefs over a period of time, and considers the larger social, political, and economic factors within a particular policy context. And so empirical data for this particular study comes out of a larger project conducted over 2016-2017 that examined Afro-Brazilian university student experiences within the context of affirmative action in Brazil. And so for the current paper, I largely draw from data collected during participant observation at 2 different campuses in the city of Rio, interviews with 39 Black students who represented 7 different institutions across the states of Rio de Janeiro and Sao Paulo, and review of relevant policy documents ranging from federal to institutional level documents. Next slide, please. So data analysis for this study occurred simultaneously with data collection. So as soon as I began collecting data, I also began analysis using MaxQDA. So transcriptions from interviews and notes from observations and document review were read and reread in order to create analytic memos. And then these memos were then used to create analytic codes to highlight reoccurrences of particular occurrences in the data. And these codes eventually became themes. And from these themes, I have developed 4 learning points that I will share as findings for what we can learn from Brazilian affirmative action. Next slide, thank you. So these learning points are race matters, student involvement, the role of the satellite campus, and the bottom-up approach. And so I don't know if I have enough time to go through all of them, but I think I'll just maybe talk about 2 of them. So I think first I'll start with race matters. Current research on the impact of affirmative action policy in Brazil shows that the number of underrepresented groups, including Black students, has increased. And so this, of course, is an indicator of success and that the policy is working. But it's also important to consider, in the context of Brazil in particular, understandings of race are complicated by high rates of miscegenation or race mixing, which has resulted in fluid understandings of racial identity, where one may be considered white in particular spaces and self-identify as brown or black in other spaces. And so this has resulted in a number of fraudulent cases of students identifying as black or brown in order to take part in the policy benefit. And so I think this is significant, one, because it highlights the messiness of racial ethnic identification the world over, right? But it also exemplifies how salient race can be in influencing social outcomes like educational attainment. And so I argue that race is a complicated matter, whereby race conscious and race neutral admissions policies deserve careful attention. And next I'll talk about the role of the satellite campus, which I think is interesting and significant for looking at a global perspective. So there was one satellite campus that I visited was a satellite campus of the State University of Rio de Janeiro, also known as UERJ. And so this particular campus served an important role for students who applied for the quota benefit because it opened up an access to a prestigious institution that they probably wouldn't have had otherwise. And so this campus was located in a largely Black and brown working class area. And having access to this campus in this particular location alleviated the stress of commuting upwards of 4 to 5 hours round trip per day to the main campus in the city of Rio. And so the satellite campus fostered an intimate and supportive environment for students and faculty, and also has a reputation for high quality and rigorous coursework. We know that location oftentimes is the common barrier to accessing post-secondary education around the world. And so this was one way that Brazil sort of replicates or shows a model of dealing with that. And next slide. So I'll just conclude here, even though I wasn't able to talk about all the findings, but I will say that the learning points here that I present are not immune to the challenges of context and governmental processes, right? And so though, of course, these things will look differently in each place, but I'm not suggesting that we duplicate everything that Brazil has done. But what I am suggesting is that when we pay attention to other ways of approaching particular educational issues, the possibilities for dialogue and solutions begin to expand. And so at that point, I believe that issues of access and equity in education and other spheres of society can be considered as global matters and not just sort of these one-off events happening in separate spheres of the world. And lastly, I would say that what is happening in the margins of sort of affirmative action scholarship or in the margins of policy that's being enacted in higher education becomes more central to the debate on affirmative action and its utility in higher education admissions worldwide. Thank you.
All right, so I am up next. So I'm Melissa Whatley. I am a postdoctoral researcher at North Carolina State University. And first off, thank you so much for being here, everyone who is joining us today, tuning in, and also thank you for the invitation to share some of my recent research. I will also apologize for my dogs who are barking in the background. They are very unhappy that they have been locked out of the room and are not allowed to join us today. But the study that I'm going to share with you today is a study exploring issues of access to education abroad among community college students. It will be appearing in the Community College Review in the near future, I hope, but you have an advanced copy of it in the readings that were provided for this webinar. So just to give you a bit of background on community college study abroad before I jump into the research. Study abroad is currently offered at around 30% of associates institutions, and participation, at least pre-COVID-19, continued to grow annually from community college students in education abroad. This may be a bit surprising to many people out in the field who may think that community college students just simply don't study abroad, but that's not true. Community college study abroad is important for a number of reasons. First, it prepares students for futures in the global economy, where international literacy is a basic skill. There are very few students who will graduate from a community college and go out into a world where they don't interact with people who are from other places. Community college study abroad is also often a lower cost, both financially, so these programs are often less expensive than programs at a four-year institution, and also academically. And what I mean by a lower cost academically is that these programs happen earlier in a student's educational trajectory. And so they are able to participate in these programs maybe before they feel like they need to devote time to other activities like internships or taking upper level coursework. These experiences are also really important for students who never transfer, who never intend to transfer. This is a study abroad through a community college is really their only opportunity to participate in these experiences. At the same time, study abroad can be used to strengthen applications to transfer to the four-year sector. And community college study abroad also provides opportunities for community members. So community college study abroad is open access, meaning that community members who are not otherwise affiliated with the college can participate in programs. Next slide, please. So the study that I'm going to present to you today is unique in that most research on study abroad participation uses data from the four-year sector. It's not that there's not any work on the community college, but there is very little looking at community college study abroad participation. And it's important to look at these institutions separately because community colleges are different. They're different in terms of students' demographics, they're different in terms of students' educational goals, and they're different in terms of the institutional climate for international education. Often practitioners and professionals working in international education at community colleges don't have the levels of support that their equivalents in the four-year sector have. So the purpose of this study is to get a better understanding of who studies abroad through community colleges, as well as when they are most likely to do so. The second purpose is particularly important for the community college, where students may not be enrolled for as long a period of time as if they were attending a four-year institution. Some of my research questions in line with those two purposes are what individual characteristics predict participation in study abroad among community college students, and then at what point over the course of their studies are these students most likely to study abroad. I approach this work from a capital resources theoretical approach, which posits that uneven social structures provide differential access to amounts and types of resources, which in turn impacts student decision-making around things like study abroad participation. The first resource is economic. So of course, those are things like receiving need-based financial aid or other kinds of financial resources that students might have to pay for study abroad. But it also includes social and cultural capital. So social capital resources are relationships that students build with other people and resources available through these relationships. And so full and part-time enrollment status might be an example of a social capital resource in that students who attend full or part-time develop different kinds of networks of support for their studies. And then cultural capital is that third kind. Those are informal, impersonal skills, habits, manners, linguistic competencies, and lifestyle preferences, as well as the importance that is placed on educational attainment and other educational experiences. And in my study, I operationalized that, for example, as students' academic objective. What kinds of degree programs are these students enrolled in? So just to give you an idea of the student characteristics that I was able to include in this study, so I'm going to divide these into two different categories. The first one are time invariant categories. So those are things like race, ethnicity, sex, residency status. And then time variant characteristics are characteristics of a student that change over time. Things like age, eligibility for need-based financial aid, GPA, academic objective, and attendance status fall into that category. And these two categories of characteristics are important for the analysis, which I'll get to in a few slides. And so the inclusion of these characteristics that change over time is really important when we think about capital resources. The volume and type of resources that an individual accesses changes over time, right? So financial aid is a good example. Once the student may have access to certain kinds of financial aid one semester, but not the next. And so in thinking and approaching this topic from a capital resources perspective, researchers often approach this from a deficit perspective, meaning that students who are lacking in something then are less likely to study abroad or attend college or those sorts of experiences. But the community college literature really challenges this deficit perspective. So some things that may seem like a barrier to participation in something like study abroad is actually not for these students. And so we might expect the findings for this particular study to be counterintuitive in that respect. I want to share a little bit with you about my data set before jumping into the findings. So the data that I use for this study are administrative data from a large urban community college that's located in the US Southeast. And like many community colleges, this college offers a variety of degree programs, a variety of educational opportunities. It really fulfills that, that multiple mission that we ascribe to the community college. Study abroad programs at this institution are almost exclusively short-term, meaning that they last, between 2 and 8 weeks. And they are offered in spring and summer terms. Students have the opportunity to go to a wide variety of regions and countries of the world. There's not limited to a specific region of the world. The cost of these programs are between $3,000 and $5,000 on average. And there are some requirements to participate in study abroad at this institution, such as a GPA minimum, a student has to be in good academic standing, etc. So the data set that I was able to access through this college is a panel data set, and I have around 100,000 student term observations, so it's a pretty big data set. And the data set contains the student characteristics that were on the previous slide, as well as an indicator of when a student studied abroad. So I know exactly what term the student went. And these are all enrolled students in the spring and summer terms from the 09-10 academic year through 16-17. In total, I have data from around 50,000 students. And I conducted an event history analysis using this data set. This kind of analysis studies an event happening over time as it unfolds. And so in the case of this study, that event is study abroad participation. An event history analysis is able to incorporate that time varying aspect of the variables. And so a student is not classified as receiving need-based aid or not. That can change each semester. And then this analysis also models the likelihood that an event will happen over time, which is important for answering that second research question. So my results, I'll talk first about the research question number 1. So what individual characteristics predict participation in study abroad among community college students? And on the next slide, this is a figure that shows the results of this event history analysis. In this figure, you'll only see the variables that emerged as significant at a standard level, with a p-value of less than 0.05. These are hazard ratios. So if a variable has a value that is above 1, that means that it's positively related to study abroad participation. If it's below 1, that means it's negatively related to study abroad participation. And so there on the left, that was in that box that you just saw, are students' degree programs. And so what you see here, generally speaking, is that students who were in any degree program, regardless of what it was, so whether it was a degree for transfer, whether it was Associates of Arts, whether it was a technical program, whether it was a certificate program, all students who had declared some sort of intent towards a degree were more likely to study abroad compared to students with nothing declared. And then over to the right, you see a few other variables that were significant in the model. So some of these results are not particularly surprising. So a student's GPA, for example, the higher the GPA, the more likely a student was to study abroad. That's not all that different from other literature on study abroad participation. It's also not surprising given the GPA requirement of these study abroad programs. We also see that in-state students are more likely to study abroad, and male students are less likely to study abroad. So that's in line with previous study abroad literature. What is somewhat surprising is that full-time students were less likely to study abroad compared to part-time students. So the inverse of that is that part-time students were more likely to participate. And then over there to the right, we see that need aid eligibility had a negative relationship with study abroad participation, but that's just barely below that one line. And so that impact is really not very big on a student's likelihood of study abroad participation. Next slide. And then turning to my second research question, which asked about at what point over the course of their studies was the student most likely to study abroad. What you see here at on the horizontal axis there of that figure is time. So that's number of terms of enrollment. Maybe not surprisingly, we see that the longer a student is enrolled, the more likely they are to study abroad. But that's really important when you think about the short amounts of time that students are often enrolled at community colleges. It signals really the importance of providing students with information about these opportunities really, really early, as soon as they decide they're going to enroll in the college. If you wait a few semesters before providing them with information about these opportunities, they're already on their way out. They're about to leave the institution. So a few implications for policy and practice from this study. So first, funding appears to be a barrier of study abroad participation. It's certainly one that should be addressed. But it's certainly not the only reason why students with international interests do not study abroad. There are other factors at play there that also should be addressed in addition to that funding piece. My results indicate that part-time students were more likely to study abroad than full-time students, which indicates that these students are interested in opportunities to study abroad. They do participate. And practitioners need to address the needs of these students when they think about designing and executing education abroad programs. And then finally, students with a variety of credential goals are interested in studying abroad, including students in technical fields. Communicating the relevance and importance of study abroad for these students is really important. And it's also important to provide them with opportunities that are relevant to their career and life goals.
All right, here I go. So, hi everyone, my name is Christina Yao. I'm an assistant professor at the University of South Carolina. I am very happy to be here. Finally not wearing athleisure for the first time in about a month. And I hope everyone's, you and your loved ones are staying safe and healthy. And so we'll go ahead and start. And I'm gonna talk a little bit about international students in US higher education. So if we can go to the next slide. There we go. Okay, so every November, so probably about the second week of November, the Institute for International Education, they publish what they call their Open Doors report. And anybody who does work in international higher ed, we all feverishly wait for that to come out early November. Those of us who are trying to get publications out, we try to get our pubs out before we have to update it with the newest data that comes out every year. So if you look at this, I just want to set the tone a little bit with looking at the graphic that tells us a little bit about the number of international students in the US. And so this is the most recent one from 2019. And so it takes in the data from 2018-19 academic year. Total number of international students is over 1 million. So it's the fourth consecutive year when we had over 1 million international students. It's a 0.05% increase over the last year, which is good news because and also that the number of first year new enrolling international students that year declined by 0.9%, which was actually considered a little bit of a success because about 2 years prior to that, there was a little bit about a 3% drop of new international students to the US, which was quite a shock actually to many of us who work in international higher education because for so many years, US has been the top destination, the numbers have been continuously climbing, and then all of a sudden things started dropping. And so right now we're at a point where every year I think it's a little bit of a crapshoot to see what happens. If we go to the next slide, this slide is also from the Open Doors data and everything. And what I want to talk about here is, what are the top 10 places of origin of international students? A lot of the work that I do in examining the experiences of international students in US institutions is really what I would say focuses on a population that I would call international students of color. And a lot of people ask, what do you mean by that? And what does that mean? And how can you make that distinction? Well, if you look at this graphic, you can see that out of the top 10 places of origin for international students, 9 out of the 10 countries would be considered non-predominantly white, non-Western countries, and also non-predominantly English speaking. Okay, and so when you think about that, is that, wow, if the majority of our students who are coming from non-predominantly white, non-Western countries, and non-predominantly English speaking, what's their experience with their transition, their sense of belonging, and then just their overall, coming here to the United States to study? We know that students, based on previous research like that Jenny Lee from University of Arizona has done many years ago, and is still very relevant now, we know that students from different regions and different countries have very different experiences. For example, students from the UK or students from Australia maybe don't have a lot of the similar adjustment issues, or they might not have experienced as many like discriminatory issues and everything that some of our other students may experience, possibly based on accent, phenotype, religion, and then also just, the visual aspects of diversity. So if we go to the next slide, in the next few slides, what I want to talk about is some of the research that I've done, a lot of it collaborative. Some of my collaborators are actually on this webinar, so if I say something wrong, feel free to jump in and correct me. That's related to international students of color. And so what I'm going to do is start more from like an overarching perspective, okay, and then funnel down a little bit into some specific studies that include participant narratives. All right, and so in this first slide, what I'm going to talk about is how international students in the US, or actually more broadly, student mobility, actually contribute to the academic imperialism and the soft power of the United States through both sending students abroad and then also hosting international students. And particularly in this slide, I pulled a little bit more specific about international students, okay? When we think about what that means, and as we commodify students, and we hear about this all the time, right? That's always one of our big critiques of how we discuss international students and scholars, how we think about international students and scholars, and why we're actually interested in hosting them in the US, right? They're full-paying students. They tend to contribute to the diversity of a university. And a lot of times when we want to increase our enrollment, the pool that we talk a lot about are international students. And so in doing all of that, it really contributes to academic imperialism, right? Which are really colonial actions that are evident in both explicit and covert ways in contemporary educational practice. And so in hosting a large population of international students really contributes to the US remaining a dominant force in relation to global student mobility, having been the top destination for many years. And so as a result, the US gains in positional competition, which is defined by how one stands relative to others within an implicit or explicit hierarchy. And so overall, what happens with that commodification of the international student, the recruitment of international students, it contributes to an overall global cultural capital that the US is able to gain. And we'll go to the next slide. And I'm going to go through these pretty briefly just because I want us to get to the discussion and everything. But this is a piece that actually came out just last year. When thinking about internationalization is conceptualized for the purpose of soft power, interest convergence arguments are represented as the primary motivation for arguing against the US travel bans. That we know that they've come out a few years ago. We've gone through multiple iterations of them. Countries are added in, some countries are taken out. And interest convergence suggests that ideas and policies that benefit underrepresented or underserved groups will only be enacted if they benefit those in privileged positions. And in this piece, Tiffany Viggiano and I, we used interest convergence as our framework to examine what are the arguments that many different associations, organizations, NGOs, what are the arguments they're arguing against the travel bans? And so we actually identified 4 specific arguments, right, about why we need to keep recruiting international students in the US, and that's garnering diversity, that they contribute to the overall diversity numbers on our campus, that they contribute to foreign policy, because in a lot of the discussions, they talked a lot about how students that we educate here actually go back and they are actually agents of democracy, or we try to spread what they've learned here in US education in their home countries. That they're here for producing knowledge, right? When we talk about like the race for STEM education or the race for participating in STEM, is that a lot of it really comes from our international students and scholars. And then obviously the biggest one is always generating economic gains for institutions, for the local community, and then also for the nation. And in the next slide is an excerpt from a co-authored article with Dr. Crystal George-Mwangi, who I know is on the call, so Crystal, correct me if I'm wrong, that came out last year. And in this article, what we do is that we argue that the experiences of international students, especially those international students that we've identified as students of color, can be examined using critical race theory. And for those of you unfamiliar with CRT, CRT has multiple tenets, including the permanence of race and racism, interest convergence, and whiteness as property. And so our argument in this paper is that when we think about international students of color here in the US, we cannot exclude the effects of race and racism, right? And so some of you on the call, or some scholars who might be critical race theorists, might say to us, hey, how can you use this? Because CRT, which comes out of critical legal studies, is actually very much based in US law, very much based within the US context, and to a certain extent, isn't it kind of imperialistic that you're using this with international students? And so our argument is really that, yes, it is a US construct, but the minute international students step onto our campuses, come to the US, they are considered racial and or ethnic minorities who are exposed to racism, nativism, and other forms of discrimination. And so that's why we have to pay attention to how racism actually is enacted through both global and local dynamics, which affect our populations of international students on our campuses. And then in our next slide, and this is where, as you can see, I'm funneling down, right? I'm funneling down a little bit more from these broad topics down into some more specific participant narratives, is that this is actually a study that was from an article, and it's actually from my dissertation. And I collected the data in 2012 and 2013, right? So using othering and neo-racism as some of my frameworks, right? Which includes issues of racism, but also nationality, language, cultural practices, and everything. Is that even in 2012, 2013, my participants, who are all Chinese international students, gave a lot of examples of blatant acts of discrimination, of people telling them, hey, go home, we don't want you here, throwing a soda can at them from a car and everything, right? And actually what was even more of an issue were some of that awareness of being outsiders, a lot more of those microaggressions, a lot of some of the things that were said or done that would indicate, you know what, I'm not sure that they really like that I'm here. And the perception was really a common theme when participants talked about their interactions with domestic students. And what I would say is that thinking about, again, the data was collected in 2012 and 2013, and right now in 2020, in the midst of a global pandemic, and I'm not convinced that anything has really changed too much, right, over the years, so. And then in the next slide, I'll let you read that really quickly. But what this was, another article that actually just came out, was part of a more of a longitudinal study that kind of followed a group of international students of color through their freshman year on campus. And this particular incident happened literally like a week before we did our second round of interviews. And so as a research team, we decided, hey, we got to ask about this, right? Because if we're asking them questions about what's your experience been here on campus, why did you even choose to come to the US, especially with all the anti-globalist policies that are in place now by the presidential administration, why are you here? This happened, and we talked to our students about it. So if we go to the next slide, these are some of the general themes that we found, right? Is that for a lot of our students, they were really worried about discrimination, about campus safety, really worried that they would run into the self-proclaimed white supremacist student on campus. So increased feelings of stress, which has been found to be a result of other campus climate studies. Also, our participants expressed a lot of confusion over US policies, particularly related to free speech. Is that they were concerned about, yes, I understand free speech, I believe in it, and I think it's important, but at what point does an institution or the administration need to step in, especially because this is at the expense of minoritized students. And then the other piece was also that a lot of students shared that they, even though they regularly communicate with friends and family back home, they did not explicitly share this incident with their family as a way to worry about them. And what was also interesting is that we had a large population of participants who would have been born pretty much right after the Rwandan genocide. And all of those participants were talking a lot about how, you know what, I grew up in a situation like this and having some of these ideologies, and I was actually really surprised that it would be here while I'm in college, because I thought going to college in the United States was going to be like High School Musical. That's a whole nother topic about why High School Musical, but that was said a lot. And also all of our students are students who identified as being men and were international students from Rwanda. Every single one of them has said to us in our first round interviews that when they came here, they were worried about discrimination, they were worried about racism, and they said that explicitly because the fact that so many Black men were being shot in this country. And so one student actually said to me that, hey, my mom doesn't want me to come here because she's afraid I'm gonna get a bullet in my head, right? So So we'll go into the next slide. So again, what I did is talk a little bit more broadly about internationalization, about race, right? About interest convergence, about all that stuff, but really funneling down to all these different experiences. You can actually scroll through, yep, and there's 3 of them. And so these are just news articles that I pulled from the past week. We know that there's been a lot of anti-Asian sentiment. We know that there's been a lot of issues related to calling this like a Chinese flu and all of that. And if I said in 2012, students were seeing racism in the residence halls and seeing that as first-year students. And we also know that international students of color have a very different experience than those who come from predominantly English-speaking, predominantly white and Western countries. And we know that race incidents are constantly happening, they're more visible, and especially right now with this global pandemic, that when you think about it, is that something that's a virus, something that is a health issue, has become very racialized, right? And thinking about that, it has become what's considered the Chinese flu, or there's a fear of Asian people, or that, you know, even other populations are, you know, we don't want to wear masks, or you have to wear a mask and things like that. And what does a mask really symbolize? And who actually had the privilege and the affordances to wear a mask and everything. So, I think that's actually it. And this might be a good transition, I think, into the larger discussion component of the webinar.
Awesome. Thank you all for your really interesting and well thought out research. We don't have a ton of time left, but I definitely want to include some of the questions we prepared for our panel discussion, as well as provide the audience with a chance to speak as well and offer any questions they have. And so some of you have touched on this a little bit, but I'm going to skip the COVID question for now, just because you've touched on it a little bit. I'm curious to know, in your opinion, what is the most important strategy for maintaining and cultivating long-term reciprocal relationships with colleagues outside of the US? All of you have done this to some regard, so if you could share a little bit more about that.
I'll go first. I think first and foremost, one, just, you know, for us, we're doing research that has sort of a global perspective and global focus, but there are many scholars and colleagues who don't think in these ways. And so I think first to understand that there are scholars and smart people doing good work in other countries, right? So I think one, just sort of having that outlook, that perspective. And I think two, once you're able to realize that and connect with folks who are doing this work, I think, you know, bringing sort of a global perspective, an international perspective to different issues of education that we study, I think will help to sort of maintain those relationships, and recognizing that, okay, even though I'm interested in higher education and I may be interested in Black student experiences, I recognize that that's just not a unique experience to the US. There are Black students attending schools in other places in the world, and Black students who are American, or Black students who ethnically identify as something else. And so I think thinking in those ways and connecting with folks who are doing this work is a way to sort of maintain relationships.
I would also add in is that I think something that's really important in thinking about just that reciprocal part, right, of the question. The reciprocal part, I think, is probably the most important piece. I think a lot of times, especially for those of us who are US scholars, is that we come from a place of amazing privilege of the fact that we're educated in the US, right? The fact that there is that perception that the US is the top education higher ed spot in the world. Whether or not we personally agree with it or disagree with it, it doesn't matter. That's that perception that's out there, right? I think that we have to be very aware of who we are, very aware of our lenses, very aware of our positionality, and very aware of the power dynamic that's inherent in that. And so in thinking about even collaborations with other scholars in other countries, is being very aware of the fact that, oh, like that there is a reciprocal relationship. And in thinking about that, you know, and being okay with giving up some of, you know, the benefits that I would get to make sure that that it is reciprocal, or that it is a fair way to do things, or that it's equitable. And even keeping in mind things like, I have a good friend and colleague who's in Vietnam, and we collaborate a lot. And then thinking about like, okay, what are the priorities? Well, in Vietnam, the priority is that you have to get published in SSCI journals, right? There's certain indexes that have to be listed in. That's really very important for global scholars. So being very aware of that, and being very aware of like, okay, so if we're working on a piece together, what are places or outlets that we can look at that really benefit you? Is it more beneficial also like, okay, how do we think about you being first author? How do we share the data? How do we do all of this and stuff? So, and so I think that piece of being very reflective, being very, very aware, and just being very conscious of what does it mean in that reciprocal relationship, and how can we do that in the rightest way possible.
Yeah, and I'll echo the sentiment there that reciprocal piece is really the most important part of this question. But from the perspective of education abroad, if we're thinking about designing, building these education abroad programs in countries outside of the US, involving local communities in the decision-making about what those programs look like, involving them in questions about the assessment of those programs. How do we determine if they are working or not, both for US students, but also assessing the impact of those programs on local communities. I think in education abroad, we have possibly understandably really focused on assessing the outcomes of US students who participate in those programs, but we have not paid enough attention to how those programs impact those local communities.
Wonderful, thank you all for your responses. Are there any questions from the attendees from the virtual audience? Okay. Also, as Dr. Yao alluded to, there is a lot of vitriol directed towards Asian students right now. So, well, always, but it's heightened right now. So in your opinion, what can institutions do? Like what's one intervention or change that institutions can make to be more proactive in supporting Asian students who are facing challenges, like racialized challenges as a result of the Chinese virus labeling?
So I can kick in real quick. I mean, I think there's two things, right? One is that there needs to be some kind of support mechanism, right? Support for our students. Also thinking about, with different offices on campus, or for example, like even the counseling center, are they aware of this? Are they ready to be proactive about possibly meeting with Asian students or Asian international students, right? Especially if you think about within the Asian culture, there may be some resistance to speaking to a counselor, to therapy and everything. And so are you different, like even, I mean, there are also some broader structural issues of, I mean, does your counseling population even represent your student population on campus? I mean, that's a whole nother topic we can get into at another time and everything too. But so one is the support mechanism, right? Like, how do you find support for this? How do you report issues like this? Because I think that is an issue that I think a lot of institutions don't think about or aren't clear and transparent about, is that, hey, this is actually how you report things that happen, okay? And the second piece that I think is that, to be very honest and very blunt, that I think institutions don't do a good enough job about is to actually tell other students to stop being racist, right? When racist incidents happen on campus, the emphasis is always, well, how do we support our students of color? How do we support our students so they feel safe? How do we support all of that, which is super important. But the question very rarely goes to like, well, you know what? Who are the jerks out there making these racist comments and saying and doing all this stuff? And how do we address it with them? And how are we proactive about that? And how do we be very direct about how this is not okay on our campus?
Thank you. Any other thoughts on that particular challenge? Okay, so I'm just jumping around a little bit on the.
Can I also add in real quick, Maseret, is that I think in thinking about with the especially with the COVID issue, is that thinking about the fact that things like the CDC says we all have to wear masks, right? I think there might be some Asian students who may be unwilling to wear a mask or uncomfortable wearing a mask because of the reactions they may get. I mean, I'm resistant to it. I flew 3 weeks ago and I was like, there is no way I'm putting a mask on in the airport because something's going to happen. Someone's going to say something to me and then we're going to get in a fight and it's going to be a real big issue all over the news and stuff, right? Like, I just don't want to deal with that. But at the same time, we also have to think about, like, especially because this is a racial issue, is that what about our Black and brown students who don't want to wear a mask, right? Like I said to my partner who's brown, and he was just like, I don't think I want to wear a mask. He's like, they're literally going to think I'm like a bandit coming after them. I was like, ooh, you're right. You're right. So, so even like thinking beyond just Chinese students from a racial perspective or Asian students, but more broadly, students of color, like we got to really think like a little bit more about what all of this means for everybody. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, I think that is a very important idea to bring up, and it's definitely a challenge that, you know, we have to be aware of, right? It's not, all people are not treated the same in the public sphere, even when public health is, like, those actions would like benefit all, right? Like we have to negotiate multiple things at the same time. Okay, in your opinion, what is the most important strategy for maintaining and cultivating? Oh, that's what I already asked. What would the recalls? So in the same vein of talking about COVID, with all of the recalls on study abroad participants, how will this impact financial and cultural losses? What are your opinions on that?
Well, so I can jump in and start us off on that one. So, I mean, in thinking about the short-term financial and cultural losses, there are certainly students and faculty who are losing money that they've invested in international experiences, as well as the benefits that they may gain from those experiences and interacting with different countries and cultures and people across borders. At the same time, I think the situation presents us with an opportunity to think about what sorts of opportunities we might be able to provide for these kinds of interactions that don't involve mobility. So things such as virtual exchange, globalizing curricula, where students are exposed to the world outside of the US without actually traveling. And of course, I think there is a value in that international travel and that study abroad and actually leaving your home country to go somewhere else and experiencing what it's like there. But we can also think about how we might provide at least some aspects of those experiences to students without ever leaving the United States. That certainly has equity implications in terms of who can access these international education experiences. That cost of international travel is a barrier to participating in these sorts of experiences for many students. And if we can bring parts of those experiences to them in the classroom here in the United States, maybe we're addressing some of those inequalities. So while of course there are these losses that are happening currently, I think it's also an opportunity for us to think about what other strategies we might use.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I think that's very thoughtful in terms of thinking, reimagining how we can, enact study abroad without people actually physically going somewhere, right? I think on the other side of that, though, I think it's important to think about how this could potentially close off borders and close off opportunities to study abroad or just connect with people transnationally. And so I think, Christina was or Dr. Yao, was alluding to this, how this does become a racialized issue. And when you think about, what bodies are able to move freely between places and spaces, right? You have a US passport, that means something, right? And so what does it mean when you call this, a Chinese virus and borders are closed off, and then, we'll get to see on the other side of this, again, who's able to move freely, who's able to come to the US, who's not. So I think in some way it allows us to reimagine study abroad and interacting globally and internationally, but I think it also begs the question of thinking about how this will limit the opportunities that we have for cross-cultural experiences.
Definitely. I just want to give the attendees one final opportunity to ask any questions before we wrap up. Oh, I think there is one. So we have one attendee asking, have any numbers come out about international students who are invited by US students, faculty, or staff families to stay with them during the social distancing period in our country if they were unable to get home? So essentially, were there any folks who were studying abroad or doing international work in the US who got stranded here?
I think anecdotally, I mean, I think it's hard because right now, I mean, we're literally in like the third week of this, I think, right? Third, fourth week, maybe. It's hard to say. I think, I know a lot of universities are keeping residence halls open or a residence hall open to try to accommodate students, which I think is a good thing. I think that, I think it's probably fairly mixed. My assumption is that international students' decision to leave or to stay might depend on where their home country is. Right. And so I think the ones definitely are Chinese students, who are the largest population of international students. I think there was a real tension of trying to decide, like, okay, if I go back home, like things like, you know, it's a curve going down a little bit. Like, is it safer if I actually leave? Right. Or if I go back, like, am I going to, I believe it said like students would have to self-quarantine for 2 weeks, stay in a hotel by themselves, right? And like pay for it out of pocket and stuff. Financially, can I afford to do that and everything? I'm honestly not really sure. I think I'm not sure that anecdotally, I don't think I personally heard about anybody who's invited by US students, faculty, or staff families to stay with them during the social distancing. What I've seen with social distancing is that people are really, really saying like, stay home with your families, right? And so I think when people think about families, it doesn't necessarily include an international student from campus.
Right.
Cynical view, so.
Well, thank you all for your time. Thank you for our audience for any questions you provided and for engaging with us today. If you'd like to continue the discussion with any of our panelists, we've included their contact information, their email, as well as their Twitter handles on this slide, in case you'd like to communicate further, ask them follow-up questions regarding their research. Just to keep you in the loop about the next webinar, it will be focused on critical policy analysis and advocacy. And our panelists will include Drs. Eric Felix, Cecilia Orphan, CJ Powell. And our moderator will be Dr. Linda D'Angelo from the University of Pittsburgh. So please put that on your calendar if you're interested. Again, if you want to find out more about the speaker series in general, we've included a link here. And thank you so much for your time and engagement. And that's the end for today.